Tonight, let us drift back to a world long before our own, where the air itself whispered of different times, and the very ground beneath our feet held secrets that would reshape everything we thought we knew about life on Earth. Close your eyes and imagine walking through landscapes so alien, so utterly transformed from anything you've ever seen, that they might as well exist on another planet entirely. The year is 252 million years ago, and if you could stand in this ancient world, you would feel something unsettling in the atmosphere around you. The forests are sparse, scattered like islands across vast stretches of barren rock. The rivers run differently here, carrying sediments of a strange reddish hue that speaks of upheaval and change. And in the distance, barely visible through the haze, something massive stirs beneath the surface of the earth itself. This is the story of the Great Dying, the most catastrophic event in the history of life on our planet. It's a tale that unfolds not with the sudden drama of an asteroid impact, but with the slow, inexorable power of geological forces that would make even our modern climate concerns seem modest by comparison. And at the center of this story lies a giant, a killer so vast and so powerful that it would ultimately claim the lives of 9 out of every 10 species that called Earth home. But what was this giant? What force could be so devastating that it would bring life itself to the very brink of extinction? The answer lies buried in the volcanic fields of what we now call Siberia, where the earth once bled molten rock for hundreds of thousands of years, creating scars that still mark the landscape today. Picture, if you will, the Siberian traps. Not traps in the sense of snares or pitfalls, but geological formations that would trap the fate of an entire planet. These weren't ordinary volcanoes, the kind that might erupt for days or weeks before falling silent. These were flood basalts, volcanic systems so enormous and so persistent that they would continue erupting for millennia, covering an area larger than modern-day Europe with layer upon layer of lava. The scale is almost impossible to comprehend. Imagine standing at the edge of this volcanic province and watching as the horizon burns with an orange glow that never fades. The air shimmers with heat, and the ground trembles constantly beneath your feet as new fissures crack open, releasing fresh torrents of molten rock. The sound is indescribable, a deep rumbling that seems to come from the very core of the planet, punctuated by the explosive roar of gas escaping from the Earth's depths. But it wasn't just the lava that made this the magma force giant so deadly. As its way to the surface, it encountered something that would transform a regional catastrophe into a global apocalypse. Beneath the Siberian landscape lay vast deposits of coal, oil, and natural gas, the compressed remains of ancient forests and seas. When the volcanic intrusions reached these deposits, they didn't simply melt them or burn them away. They cooked them, releasing enormous quantities of carbon dioxide, methane, and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Can you imagine the moment when this process began? The first volcanic intrusion pierces through a coal seam, and suddenly the air fills with a different kind of smoke. Not just the familiar gray ash of volcanic eruptions, but thick, choking clouds laden with carbon compounds that would fundamentally alter the chemistry of the atmosphere. The sky begins to change color, taking on hues that no living creature had ever seen before. The effects were swift and merciless. As carbon dioxide levels soared, global temperatures began to rise at a rate that made adaptation nearly impossible. The oceans, which had served as Earth's great stabilizers for billions, and acidify. The dell of years began to warmicate balance of marine ecosystems, built up over hundreds of millions of years of evolution, started to collapse. In the shallow seas that covered much of the Earth's surface, coral reefs that had taken millennia to grow began to bleach and crumble. Fish populations crashed as their food sources disappeared. Even the mighty marine reptiles, the apex predators of their time, found themselves struggling to survive in waters that were becoming increasingly hostile to life. But perhaps the most insidious effect was what happened to the ocean's oxygen levels. As temperatures rose and the water became more acidic, the microscopic organisms that formed the base of the marine food web began to die off in massive numbers. When these creatures decomposed, they consumed oxygen, creating vast dead zones where nothing could survive. The oceans, once teeming with life, became increasingly barren and lifeless. On land, the effects were equally devastating. The rising temperatures and changing atmospheric chemistry wreaked havoc on plant communities. Forests that had stood for millions of years began to wither and die. The complex ecosystems that had evolved around these forests collapsed as their foundation disappeared. Herbivorous animals found themselves without food sources, and the carnivores that depended on them soon followed. The air itself became difficult to breathe. The massive release of gases from the Siberian traps didn't just change the climate, it changed the very composition of the atmosphere. Sulfur compounds created acid rain that poisoned rivers and lakes. Toxic gases made the air lethal to many forms of life. Even creatures that might have otherwise survived the temperature changes found themselves unable to cope with the altered atmospheric conditions. And still, the Siberian traps continued to erupt. Year after year, decade after decade, century after century, the volcanic giant continued its relentless assault on the planet's biosphere. Each new eruption added more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, pushing global temperatures ever higher. Each intrusion into coal and oil deposits released more toxic compounds into the air and water. The die-off wasn't sudden. It unfolded over hundreds of thousands of years, a slow-motion apocalypse that gave life just enough time to struggle against the changing conditions before ultimately succumbing. Fossil records from this period tell a story of gradual decline punctuated by moments of rapid collapse. Species that had ruled their ecosystems for millions of years simply vanished from the geological record, leaving behind only traces in the rock to mark their passing. In the marine realm, the trilobites, those armored arthropods that had been among Earth's most successful creatures for over 270 million years, finally met their end. These remarkable animals had survived multiple mass extinctions, adapting and evolving through countless environmental changes. But the Great Dying proved too much even for these ultimate survivors. The last trilobites disappeared into the fossil record, marking the end of one of life's most enduring success stories. The brachiopods, shellfish that had dominated the ocean floor for hundreds of millions of years, were nearly wiped out entirely. Of the hundreds of species that existed before the Great Dying, only a handful survived to see the world that emerged afterward. Their ecological niches would eventually be filled by other creatures, but the unique forms that had characterized Paleozoic seas were lost forever. On land, the situation was equally grim. The synapsids, the distant ancestors of modern mammals, saw their diversity collapse. Many of the large herbivorous species that had roamed the supercontinent of Pangaea simply disappeared. The ecosystems they had shaped and maintained for millions of years crumbled without their presence. But perhaps most telling was what happened to the insects. These creatures, with their incredible ability to adapt and diversify, had survived every previous mass extinction with remarkable success. Yet even they couldn't escape the effects of the Siberian giant. Many insect orders went extinct during this period, and those that survived often did so as mere shadows of their former diversity. The plant kingdom suffered equally devastating losses. Entire forests disappeared, their remains compressed into the coal deposits that would one day fuel human civilization. The complex plant communities that had taken millions of years to evolve were reduced to simple, sparse vegetation, struggling to survive in the hostile new climate. As we drift deeper into this ancient catastrophe, we begin to understand the true scale of what the Siberian traps unleashed upon the world. This wasn't simply a volcanic eruption, no matter how massive. It was a complete reorganization of Earth's systems, a fundamental alteration of the conditions that made complex life possible. The giant that emerged from beneath Siberia was unlike anything that had threatened life before mass. Previous extinctions had been caused by asteroid impacts or ice ages, events that were dramatic but relatively brief in geological terms. The Great Dying was different. It was a sustained assault that lasted for hundreds of thousands of years, giving life no time to recover between waves of destruction. And still, through it all, life persisted. In the deepest ocean trenches, in the most remote corners of the continents, in the smallest refugia, where conditions remained just barely tolerable, some creatures managed to survive. They were the remnants, the scattered survivors of a world that had been almost completely erased. These survivors would become the foundation for everything that followed. From their ranks would emerge the dinosaurs, the mammals, the birds, and eventually, millions of years later, us. But that recovery would take time, vast stretches of geological time, during which the Earth slowly healed from the wounds inflicted by its volcanic giant. The story of the Great Dying reminds us of something profound about our planet and the life it supports. Earth is not a stable, unchanging stage upon which the drama of evolution plays out. It is a dynamic, sometimes violent world where geological forces can reshape everything we think we know about life itself. The survivors of this great catastrophe found themselves inheriting a world that bore little resemblance to the one their ancestors had known. The Earth of the early Triassic period, some 250 million years ago, was a planet stripped of its biological complexity, a canvas wiped almost clean and waiting to be painted anew. Imagine walking through this recovering world. The landscapes stretch before you in muted tones, dominated by simple ferns and sparse conifer forests. Gone are the lush, diverse plant communities that once carpeted the continents. In their place, hardy pioneer species struggle to establish themselves in soils still scarred by acid rain and toxic runoff from the great volcanic outpourings. The silence is perhaps the most striking feature of this post-apocalyptic world. Where once the air might have buzzed with the sounds of countless insects and the calls of diverse vertebrates, now there is an almost cathedral-like quiet, broken only by the wind through sparse vegetation and the distant rumble of geological processes still working to heal the Earth's wounded crust. But life, as it always does, began to find a way forward. In the warm, humid conditions that followed the Great Dying, certain groups of organisms discovered opportunities that had never existed before. The extinction of so many dominant species had opened ecological niches that had been occupied for millions of years, creating space for evolutionary innovation on a scale that the planet had rarely seen. Among the most remarkable of these opportunities was the one that presented itself to a group of reptiles that we now call the archosaurs. Before the Great Dying, these creatures had been relatively minor players in terrestrial ecosystems, overshadowed by the large synapsids that dominated most land environments. But with their competitors largely eliminated, the archosaurs began an evolutionary radiation that would ultimately give rise to some of the most spectacular creatures ever to walk the earth. Can you picture these early archosaurs as they began to diversify in the aftermath of the catastrophe? They were not yet the giants they would become, but even in these early stages, you could see hints of the majesty that lay in their future. Some walked on four legs, their bodies low to the ground as they searched for food in the sparse vegetation. Others had already begun to experiment with bipedal locomotion, rising up on their hind legs to survey their domain or to reach higher branches that other animals could not access. The oceans, too, were slowly beginning to recover from the devastation that had claimed so many of their inhabitants. The acidified waters gradually returned to more neutral conditions as the Earth's natural buffering systems worked to restore balance. In the shallow seas, new forms of marine life began to appear, many of them unlike anything that had existed before the Great Dying. Among these innovations were the early marine reptiles, creatures that would eventually grow to enormous sizes and dominate the ocean ecosystems of the Mesozoic era. In the immediate aftermath of the extinction, these were modest animals, perhaps no larger than modern dolphins, but they possessed something that their predecessors had lacked: the freedom to evolve without the constraints imposed by hundreds of millions of years of established ecosystem structure. The recovery was not uniform across the planet. Some regions, particularly those closer to the Siberian traps themselves, remained largely barren for millions of years after the main phase of the extinction had ended. The soils in these areas had been so thoroughly poisoned by the volcanic emissions that they could support only the most tolerant plant species. Yet even here, life slowly began to return, carried by winds and waters from more hospitable regions. In other areas, particularly in the southern parts of the supercontinent Pangaea, recovery proceeded more quickly. Here, small pockets of survivors had managed to persist through the worst of the catastrophe, and from these refugia, life began to spread outward once again. The early Triassic fossil record from these regions shows a fascinating picture of biological experimentation, with new species appearing and disappearing in rapid succession as evolution tested different solutions to the challenges of the post-extinction world. One of the most significant changes was in the structure of terrestrial food webs. Before the Great Dying, these had been complex, multi-layered systems with numerous species filling specialized roles. In the aftermath, food webs were much simpler, often consisting of just a few key species that had to perform multiple ecological functions. This simplification would persist for millions of years, gradually giving way to increased complexity only as new species evolved to fill the vacant niches. The climate itself continued to play a major role in shaping the recovery. The greenhouse gases released by the Siberian traps had pushed global temperatures to levels not seen since the early Paleozoic era. These hot, humid conditions favored certain types of organisms while making life difficult for others. Reptiles, with their ability to regulate their body temperature behaviorally, found themselves at a significant advantage in this new world. As we drift further into this age of recovery, we begin to see the emergence of some truly remarkable creatures. In the Middle Triassic, roughly 15 million years after the Great Dying, the fossil record begins to show evidence of the first truly large archosaurs. These were not yet dinosaurs, but they were their close relatives, and in their bones we can see the architectural innovations that would eventually give rise to the giants of the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods. Picture one of these Middle Triassic archosaurs as it moves through the recovering landscape. Perhaps it stands 8 feet tall at the shoulder, its body balanced on powerful hind limbs that speak of speed and agility. Its skull is elongated, filled with sharp teeth that mark it as a predator. This is not yet the massive tyrannosaur that would one day rule Cretaceous ecosystems, but it is clearly moving in that direction, evolution testing the limits of what is possible in this new world. The plant life, too, was undergoing its own evolutionary experiments. The simple fern prairies of the earliest Triassic were gradually giving way to more diverse communities dominated by new types of conifers and the first representatives of plant groups that would become important in later periods. These early forests were still relatively open compared to their Paleozoic predecessors, but they provided enough structure to support increasingly complex animal communities. In the oceans, the recovery was equally dramatic. The simple marine ecosystems of the early Triassic began to give way to more complex communities as new types of marine reptiles, fish, and invertebrates evolved to fill the ecological roles left vacant by the Great Dying. By the Middle Triassic, some of these marine reptiles had grown to impressive sizes, with species reaching lengths of 20 feet or more. The story of recovery from the Great Dying is ultimately a story about resilience and the incredible creative power of evolution when given the opportunity to operate in an ecological vacuum. The survivors of the Siberian giant's assault on life didn't simply restore the world that had been lost. Instead, they created something entirely new, a biological world that was in many ways more spectacular than what had come before. But this recovery was not without its own challenges and setbacks. The climate remained unstable for millions of years after the main extinction event, with periodic episodes of warming and cooling that would periodically disrupt the recovering ecosystems. Volcanic activity, while never again reaching the scale of the Siberian traps, continued to punctuate the Triassic with smaller eruptions that would sometimes cause local or regional extinctions. Yet through it all, life persisted and diversified. The archosaurs continued their evolutionary radiation, giving rise to the first true dinosaurs by the late Triassic. Those early dinosaurs were relatively small creatures, no larger than modern dogs, but they possess the basic body plan that would eventually be scaled up to produce the largest land animals that ever lived. Can you imagine encountering one of these early dinosaurs in the late Triassic landscape? Perhaps it stands no higher than your waist, its body covered in simple scales or perhaps even primitive feathers. Its eyes are bright and alert, constantly scanning its surroundings for both opportunities and threats. This small creature carries within its genes the potential for all the magnificent forms that dinosaurs would eventually take: the long-necked sauropods, the armored ankylosaurs, the swift predators, and the aerial masters that would become birds. The marine realm was equally dynamic during this period of recovery and innovation. The oceans of the Middle and Late Triassic were home to some of the most bizarre marine reptiles ever to evolve. There were the early ichthyosaurs, dolphin-like reptiles that had returned to the sea and were already showing remarkable adaptations for aquatic life. Their eyes were enormous, adapted for hunting in the dim depths of the ocean, and their bodies were streamlined for speed and efficiency. Alongside them swam the placoodonts, unusual reptiles that had evolved to crush shellfish with their powerful jaws and flattened teeth. Some of these creatures developed turtle-like shells, convergently evolving armor plating similar to that of true turtles, but through completely independent evolutionary pathways. The diversity of solutions that evolution found to the challenges of marine life during this period is truly remarkable. The late Triassic also saw the emergence of the first pterosaurs, reptiles that had conquered the skies in the wake of the extinction of many flying insects during the Great Dying. These early flying reptiles were generally small, with wingspans measured in feet rather than yards, but they represented another major evolutionary innovation arising from the opportunities created by the Great Extinction. As the Triassic period drew to a close, roughly 50 million years after the Great Dying, the world had been thoroughly transformed. The simple, impoverished ecosystems of the early Triassic had given way to complex communities that in many ways surpassed the diversity of the pre-extinction world. The stage was set for the age of dinosaurs, an era that would see life on Earth reach new heights of size, diversity, and ecological complexity. But even as these new ecosystems flourished, the shadow of the Siberian giant still lingered. The coal beds and oil deposits that the volcanic intrusions had encountered were largely exhausted, but the carbon they had released into the atmosphere continued to influence global climate patterns. The greenhouse world of the Triassic, with its hot, humid conditions and high sea levels, was in many ways a direct consequence of that ancient volcanic catastrophe. The fossil record from this period tells us something profound about the nature of extinction and recovery. The Great Dying had indeed been the most severe crisis in the history of life on Earth, eliminating an estimated 90% of all species. Yet from the ashes of this catastrophe had emerged a biological world that was in many ways more spectacular than what had been lost. This pattern of destruction and renewal would repeat itself several more times in Earth's history, though never again on quite the same scale as the Great Dying. Each major extinction event would clear ecological space for new evolutionary radiations, leading to the emergence of new groups of organisms that might never have had the opportunity to diversify in a more crowded biological world. The story of the Great Dying and its aftermath reminds us that extinction, while tragic for the species that experience it, is also one of the great creative forces in the history of life. Without the periodic clearing of ecological space through extinction events, evolution might never have produced the incredible diversity of life forms that have graced our planet over the past 3.8 billion years. As we continue to drift through this ancient world, we begin to understand that the Siberian giant, for all its destructive power, was ultimately just one chapter in the much larger story of life on Earth. The volcanic catastrophe that claimed 90% of all species was devastating beyond imagination, yet it also set the stage for some of the most remarkable evolutionary innovations in the planet's history. The dinosaurs that would soon inherit the Earth were themselves the indirect products of this ancient catastrophe, as were the mammals that would eventually succeed them, and ultimately the lineage that would give rise to our own species. In a very real sense, we are all children of the Great Dying, beneficiaries of the evolutionary opportunities that were created by that ancient volcanic giant. And so the Earth turned, carrying its cargo of survivors into an uncertain but promising future. The scars of the great catastrophe slowly healing beneath new forests and new oceans, as life once again began its eternal dance of innovation and adaptation, forever reaching toward new possibilities in the endless theater of deep time. The transformation of life in the wake of the Great Dying was not a simple matter of species returning to fill empty spaces. Something far more profound was happening beneath the surface of this recovering world, something that would fundamentally alter the very nature of life on Earth for hundreds of millions of years to come. As the early Triassic gave way to the Middle Period, roughly 10 million years after the Great Catastrophe, subtle changes began to appear in the fossil record that hint at revolutionary developments taking place within the bodies of the surviving creatures. The archosaurs, those reptilian survivors that had begun their remarkable diversification, were undergoing internal modifications that would prove far more significant than their changing external forms. Picture, if you will, the interior of one of these middle Triassic archosaurs. If you could somehow shrink down and travel through its circulatory system, you would discover something remarkable happening within its chest cavity. The heart, that most vital of organs, was beginning to develop a more sophisticated structure than had been seen in reptiles before. Additional chambers were forming, creating a more efficient system for pumping blood throughout the body. This might seem like a minor anatomical detail, but the implications were enormous. A more efficient heart meant that these creatures could maintain higher activity levels for longer periods. They could run faster, hunt more effectively, and explore territories that would have been inaccessible to their predecessors. The four-chambered heart that was slowly evolving in these early archosaurs would eventually become one of the defining characteristics of their most famous descendants. But the changes went deeper than circulation alone. Within the bones themselves, a remarkable transformation was taking place. The solid, dense bone structure typical of most reptiles was giving way to something entirely new. Hollow spaces began to appear within the bone matrix, creating structures that were simultaneously lighter and stronger than what had come before. Can you imagine the first archosaur to possess these pneumatic bones as it moved through the late Triassic landscape? Its steps would have been lighter, its movements more graceful. When it leaped to catch prey or escape danger, it would have found itself capable of feats that its ancestors could never have achieved. The reduction in body weight provided by these air-filled bones was opening up possibilities that evolution had never been able to explore before. These hollow bones served another purpose as well, one that would prove even more revolutionary in the long run. They were connected to the respiratory system, creating a network of air sacs throughout the body that allowed for a completely new method of breathing. Instead of the simple in and out motion of typical reptilian lungs, these creatures were developing a flow-through system that extracted oxygen far more efficiently from each breath. The advantages of this new respiratory system were particularly pronounced in the thin air of high altitudes or during periods of intense physical activity. An archosaur with this advanced breathing apparatus could maintain its energy levels in situations where other reptiles would quickly become exhausted. It was an adaptation that would prove crucial as these creatures began to grow larger and more active. In the recovering forests of the Middle Triassic, these physiological innovations were beginning to manifest in remarkable ways. Some archosaurs were experimenting with bipedal locomotion on a more permanent basis, rising up on their hind legs not just occasionally, but as their primary mode of movement. The efficient hearts and lightweight bones made this energetically demanding lifestyle possible for the first time in vertebrate history. Others were beginning to show the first hints of another revolutionary development. Along the edges of their scales, particularly on the arms and around the neck, strange filamentous structures were beginning to appear. These were not scales in the traditional sense, nor were they the smooth skin typical of reptiles. They were something entirely new, structures that would eventually be recognized as the earliest forms of feathers. These primitive feathers served multiple purposes in their early stages of evolution. They provided insulation, helping these increasingly active creatures maintain their body temperature during the cool nights of the Triassic world. They may have also played a role in display, with different species developing different colors and patterns to communicate with potential mates or rivals. But perhaps most importantly, these early feathers were laying the groundwork for what would eventually become one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of life on Earth. The hollow bones, efficient hearts, and advanced respiratory systems that were evolving in these Middle Triassic archosaurs were creating the physiological foundation necessary for powered flight. The late Triassic world, some 220 million years ago, was a landscape of evolutionary experimentation unlike anything seen before or since. The ecological niches left vacant by the Great Dying were being filled not just by new species, but by entirely new types of organisms with capabilities that transcended the limitations of their ancestors. In the conifer forests that now covered much of the recovering continents, creatures were beginning to appear that seemed to blur the boundaries between different groups of animals. Some retained the clearly reptilian characteristics of their ancestors while displaying behaviors and capabilities that were entirely novel. Others had evolved so far from their starting points that they seemed to represent something completely new. Among the most remarkable of these experimental forms were the early members of a group that paleontologists would eventually call dinosaurs. The name itself means terrible lizard, But this designation hardly does justice to the incredible diversity of forms that these creatures would eventually take. In their earliest manifestations, during the late Triassic, they were still relatively modest in size, but they possessed a combination of characteristics that would prove to be extraordinarily successful. These early dinosaurs had inherited all of the physiological innovations of their archosaur ancestors. Their hearts pumped blood with unprecedented efficiency. Their hollow bones made them both strong and light. Their advanced respiratory systems allowed them to maintain high levels of activity that would have been impossible for earlier reptiles. But they had added something more to this already impressive package. Their limbs had been completely reorganized, with the legs positioned directly beneath the body rather than sprawled out to the sides like those of typical reptiles. This upright posture was far more efficient for terrestrial locomotion, allowing these creatures to move with a grace and speed that their contemporaries could not match. Some species were already showing adaptations for rapid running, with long, powerful hind limbs and reduced forelimbs that served primarily for balance and manipulation. The skulls of these early dinosaurs were also undergoing significant modifications. Many species developed large eye sockets, suggesting that vision was becoming increasingly important in their daily lives. Their brains were growing larger relative to their body size, and the regions associated with coordination and spatial awareness were particularly well developed. As you drift through these late Triassic landscapes in your imagination, you might encounter one of these early dinosaurs as it moves through a grove of primitive conifers. Perhaps it stands no taller than a modern deer, but there is something distinctly different about the way it carries itself. Its movements are quick and precise, its head held high as it scans the surrounding vegetation for signs of prey or danger. Its skin might be covered with a mixture of scales and primitive feathers, giving it an almost iridescent quality in the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy above. When it moves, it does so with a fluid grace that speaks of perfect coordination between its advanced nervous system and its precisely engineered skeletal structure. But this creature represents just one small branch on what was rapidly becoming an enormous evolutionary tree. In other parts of the late Triassic world, different groups of archosaurs were exploring entirely different solutions to the challenges of life in the post-extinction world. Some were growing to enormous sizes, becoming the first truly gigantic land animals to evolve since the Great Dying. These early giants, while not yet reaching the spectacular proportions of later sauropod dinosaurs, were already demonstrating the potential for vertebrate life to achieve scales that had been unimaginable in the Paleozoic world. Others were returning to aquatic environments, developing the streamlined bodies and powerful tails that would allow them to compete with the marine reptiles that were simultaneously evolving in the world's oceans. These early crocodilian ancestors were already showing the semi-aquatic lifestyle that their descendants would perfect over the following millions of years. Perhaps most remarkably of all, some archosaurs were beginning to experiment with aerial locomotion. The pterosaurs, those remarkable flying reptiles, were starting to appear in the fossil record of the late Triassic. These early forms were still relatively small, but they had already developed the wing membranes and specialized skeletal adaptations that would allow them to become masters of the Mesozoic skies. The diversity of solutions that archosaurs found to the challenges of life in the post-extinction world is truly breathtaking. Within the span of just a few tens of millions of years, this single group of reptiles had given rise to creatures adapted for virtually every conceivable lifestyle. There were runners and swimmers, climbers and flyers, herbivores and carnivores, giants and miniatures. This explosive diversification was made possible by the unique combination of circumstances that existed in the wake of the Great Dying. The volcanic giant that had devastated the Earth's biosphere had inadvertently created the perfect conditions for evolutionary innovation. The elimination of established ecosystems had removed the competitive pressures that might have prevented such radical experimentation. At the same time, the changing climate conditions of the Triassic world provided both challenges and opportunities that favored certain types of adaptations. The warm, humid conditions that persisted throughout much of this period were ideal for active, warm-blooded metabolism, encouraging the evolution of the sophisticated physiological systems that characterized the archosaurs. The late Triassic also saw the emergence of the first true mammals, though these were still tiny creatures that lived in the shadows of their reptilian contemporaries. These early mammals had evolved from a different lineage of survivors from the Great Dying, the cynodonts, which were themselves descendants of the synapsids that had dominated pre-extinction ecosystems. Like the archosaurs, these early mammals were developing their own suite of revolutionary adaptations. They were experimenting with fur for insulation, milk production for feeding their young, and increasingly sophisticated sensory systems that allowed them to exploit ecological niches that were unavailable to other vertebrates. The interaction between these various groups of survivors and innovators was creating ecosystem dynamics that were entirely novel in Earth's history. The simple food webs of the early Triassic were giving way to increasingly complex networks of predator-prey relationships, competitive interactions, and symbiotic partnerships. In the marine realm, a parallel revolution was taking place. The oceans of the late Triassic were home to marine reptiles that had achieved sizes and capabilities that rivaled anything in the modern seas. The early ichthyosaurs had evolved to become supremely efficient aquatic predators, with some species reaching lengths of over 30 feet. These marine giants possessed many of the same physiological innovations as their terrestrial relatives. Their hearts had been modified for the demands of deep diving and rapid swimming. Their bones showed adaptations for the unique stresses of aquatic life. Their sensory systems had been fine-tuned for hunting in the three-dimensional environment of the open ocean. The late Triassic seas also witnessed the evolution of the first truly gigantic marine reptiles. Some of the largest ichthyosaurs from this period approached the size of modern sperm whales, making them among the largest vertebrates that had ever existed up to that point in Earth's history. These creatures were the oceanic equivalents of the giant land animals that were simultaneously evolving on the continents. As the Triassic period drew toward its close, the stage was set for one of the most spectacular chapters in the history of life on Earth. The survivors of the Great Dying had not merely restored the biological diversity that had been lost, they had created something entirely new and unprecedented. The physiological and anatomical innovations that had evolved in the wake of the Great Extinction had opened up possibilities that life had never been able to explore before. The archosaurs, in particular, had developed a suite of adaptations that would allow them to achieve dominance over terrestrial ecosystems for the next 160 million years. Their efficient hearts, hollow bones, advanced respiratory systems, and upright posture gave them capabilities that no previous land animals had possessed. They were poised to become the rulers of the Mesozoic world. But even as these remarkable creatures were preparing to inherit the Earth, the planet itself was preparing another test of their resilience. The late Triassic was punctuated by another period of extensive volcanism, this time centered in what would become the Atlantic Ocean basin. The Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, while not as massive as the Siberian traps that had caused the Great Dying, was still substantial enough to cause significant environmental disruption. This late Triassic extinction event, while much smaller in scale than the Great Dying, would nevertheless reshape the biological landscape once again. Many of the experimental forms that had evolved in the aftermath of the earlier catastrophe would not survive this second test. The large, primitive archosaurs that had dominated early Triassic ecosystems were among the casualties. But the more advanced archosaur lineages, those that had developed the most sophisticated physiological adaptations, proved to be remarkably resilient. The early dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and crocodilian ancestors not only survived the late Triassic extinction, but emerged from it in a position to dominate the ecosystems of the following Jurassic period. Can you picture the world that emerged from this second great transition? The late Triassic had been a time of experimentation and innovation, but the early Jurassic would be an age of refinement and expansion. The basic body plans and physiological systems that had evolved in the wake of the Great Dying were about to be scaled up and diversified in ways that would produce some of the most magnificent creatures ever to walk the earth. The small, deer-sized dinosaurs of the late Triassic would give rise to giants that dwarfed every land animal that had come before them. The early pterosaurs would evolve into aerial masters with wingspans that exceeded those of any flying creature before or since. The primitive marine reptiles would grow to sizes that rivaled the largest whales. But perhaps most remarkably of all, some of the small, feathered dinosaurs would eventually take to the air themselves, giving rise to birds and opening up an entirely new chapter in the story of life on Earth. The hollow bones, efficient hearts, and advanced respiratory systems that had evolved in response to the challenges of the post-extinction Triassic world would prove to be perfectly suited for the demands of powered flight. As we continue to drift through deep time, following the thread of life's recovery from its greatest catastrophe, we begin to see how the volcanic giant that had once threatened to end the story of life on Earth had instead become the catalyst for its most spectacular chapter. The Great Dying had cleared the stage, and the survivors had used that empty stage to choreograph a dance of evolution that would produce wonders beyond imagination. The forests of the early Jurassic were beginning to echo with new sounds. The calls of pterosaurs soaring overhead mixed with the trumpeting of early sauropods stretching their long necks toward the canopy. In the underbrush, small theropod dinosaurs stalked their prey with predatory efficiency, while primitive mammals scurried through the leaf litter, their keen senses alert for both opportunities and dangers. This was a world transformed, a biological landscape that bore little resemblance to anything that had existed before the Great Dying. The Paleozoic world of trilobites and ancient amphibians seemed like a distant dream compared to the dynamic, energetic ecosystems that were now taking shape across the planet. And still, the innovations continued. Evolution, freed from the constraints of established ecosystems by the Great Extinction, was continuing to explore new possibilities with unprecedented creativity. The Jurassic world would see the emergence of the first truly gigantic dinosaurs, creatures so large that they challenged the very limits of what terrestrial vertebrates could achieve. The long-necked sauropods that were beginning to appear in the early Jurassic fossil record represented a completely novel solution to the challenge of terrestrial herbivory. By growing to enormous sizes and developing extremely long necks, these creatures could access food sources that were unavailable to other animals. They could browse on the tops of trees while their bulk protected them from most predators. But achieving such enormous size required the full suite of physiological adaptations that had evolved in the Archosaur lineage. Their hearts had to pump blood through necks that could extend 30 feet or more above the ground. Their hollow bones had to provide structural support while keeping body weight manageable. Their advanced respiratory systems had to supply oxygen to tissues that might be separated by dozens of feet from the nearest breathing surface. The theropod dinosaurs were simultaneously exploring the other end of the size spectrum, developing into increasingly sophisticated predators. Some remained small and agile, perfecting the art of pursuit hunting in dense vegetation. Others grew to enormous sizes, becoming apex predators capable of bringing down even the largest herbivores. In the marine realm, the ichthyosaurs were reaching their evolutionary peak. Some species achieved whale-like proportions, while others developed the streamlined bodies and enormous eyes of deep-sea specialists. The plesiosaurs, another group of marine reptiles, were experimenting with different approaches to aquatic predation, some developing the long necks and small heads of fish specialists, while others evolved massive heads and short necks optimized for hunting larger prey. The pterosaurs were also continuing their remarkable diversification. From the crow-sized forms of the late Triassic, they were evolving into creatures with wingspans measured in tens of feet. Some specialized in soaring flight, using their enormous wings to ride thermal currents across vast distances. Others developed powerful flight muscles that allowed them to engage in active, flapping flight like modern birds. But perhaps the most significant development of the early Jurassic was one that would not become apparent in the fossil record for millions of years to come. Among the small, feathered theropod dinosaurs, evolutionary pressures were beginning to favor increasingly sophisticated feather structures and flight-related adaptations. These early experiments in powered flight were taking place in creatures that were still fundamentally dinosaurian in their anatomy. They retained the long tails, toothed jaws, and clawed hands of their terrestrial ancestors. But their feathers were becoming more complex, developing the asymmetrical structures necessary for generating lift and thrust. Their skeletons were also undergoing subtle modifications that would prove crucial for flight. The sternum was enlarging to provide attachment points for powerful flight muscles. The arms were lengthening, and the hands were becoming more specialized for wing support. The tail was beginning to shorten, reducing unnecessary weight and improving maneuverability. Can you imagine one of these early flying dinosaurs as it takes its first tentative flights through the Jurassic forests? Perhaps it launches itself from a high branch, its primitive wings beating frantically as it glides toward another tree. Its landing might be awkward, more of a controlled crash than the graceful touchdown of a modern bird, but it represents a moment of profound significance in the history of life on Earth. This small, struggling flyer carries within its genes the potential for all the aerial mastery that birds would eventually achieve. The powered flight that it is just beginning to master will eventually carry its descendants across oceans, over mountain ranges, and to every corner of the globe. The songs that its primitive vocal cords might produce will evolve into the complex melodies that fill modern forests with music. As the Jurassic period progressed, these innovations in flight would be refined and perfected. The early flying dinosaurs would give rise to increasingly bird-like creatures, eventually producing animals that were virtually indistinguishable from modern birds in their flight capabilities. The transition from ground-dwelling dinosaur to aerial master would be one of evolution's most remarkable achievements. But flight was just one of many extraordinary developments that were taking place in the post-extinction world. The mammals, those small, furry survivors that had emerged alongside the dinosaurs from the ashes of the Great Dying, were conducting their own evolutionary experiments in the shadows of the Mesozoic world. These early mammals had already developed many of the characteristics that would eventually make them successful: fur for insulation, milk for nourishing their young, and keen senses that allowed them to exploit nocturnal niches. During the Jurassic, they began to diversify into different ecological roles, though they remained small and relatively inconspicuous compared to their reptilian contemporaries. Some early mammals specialized in insect eating, developing sharp teeth and quick reflexes for catching small prey. Others became seed eaters, evolving grinding teeth and digestive systems adapted for processing plant material. Still others took to the trees, developing grasping hands and long tails for arboreal locomotion. In the oceans, marine mammals were still tens of millions of years in the future, but the seas of the Jurassic were nonetheless teeming with remarkable creatures. The marine reptiles had achieved a diversity and abundance that would never be equaled in later periods. Ichthyosaurs filled the role of dolphins and whales, while plesiosaurs occupied niches similar to those of modern seals and sea lions. Some of these marine reptiles achieved truly staggering proportions. The largest ichthyosaurs approached lengths of 80 feet or more, making them among the largest vertebrates that ever lived. Their eyes, preserved in exceptional detail in some fossils, were the size of dinner plates, adapted for hunting in the dim depths of Jurassic seas. The plant life of the Jurassic world was also undergoing significant changes. The simple conifer forests of the early Triassic had given way to more diverse communities that included the first appearance of several plant groups that remain important today. Ferns reached new levels of diversity and abundance, creating lush understories beneath the conifer canopies. But perhaps most significantly, the Jurassic saw the first appearance of flowering plants, though these remained rare and inconspicuous throughout most of the period. These early angiosperms were small, weedy plants that might easily be overlooked in the grand landscapes of the Mesozoic world. Yet they carried within their genes the potential for a revolution that would eventually transform terrestrial ecosystems as thoroughly as the rise of the dinosaurs had transformed vertebrate life. The coevolution of flowering plants and their pollinators would become one of the great success stories of the Cretaceous period, leading to an explosion of diversity in both plant and insect communities. But in the Jurassic, these developments were still in their infancy, barely visible among the dominant conifers and ferns. As we drift further through the Jurassic world, we begin to appreciate the full magnitude of the transformation that had taken place since the Great Dying. The simple, impoverished ecosystems of the early Triassic had given way to biological communities of unprecedented complexity and grandeur. The innovations that had evolved in response to the Great Extinction had opened up entirely new realms of possibility for life on Earth. The volcanic giant that had once threatened to end the story of life had instead become its greatest catalyst. The destruction it had wrought had cleared the evolutionary stage for a drama of unprecedented scope and magnificence. The survivors had not merely restored what had been lost, they had created something entirely new, a biological world that surpassed anything that had come before it in both diversity and spectacular achievement, and the story was far from over. The Jurassic period would give way to the Cretaceous, an era that would see even greater innovations and more spectacular creatures. The small flying dinosaurs of the Jurassic would evolve into true birds, masters of the air that would outlive all their non-avian relatives. The flowering plants would undergo their own explosive radiation, transforming the appearance of terrestrial landscapes and creating new ecological opportunities for countless other organisms. But all of these future marvels traced their origins back to that ancient catastrophe, to the moment when the Siberian traps began their relentless assault on the biosphere of the late Paleozoic world. The Great Dying had been the most severe crisis in the history of life, but it had also been the beginning of life's greatest adventure. As the Jurassic sun set over landscapes populated by creatures that would have seemed impossible to the inhabitants of the pre-extinction world, the Earth continued its ancient rotation, carrying its cargo of evolutionary experiments toward an uncertain but promising future. The legacy of the Great Extinction lived on in every dinosaur footprint, every pterosaur wing beat, every mammal heartbeat in the Mesozoic darkness. The Cretaceous world that emerged from the shadows of the Jurassic was a realm of unprecedented abundance, where life had learned to paint itself in colors that had never existed before. Can you imagine walking through these ancient landscapes, where the very air seemed to shimmer with possibilities that evolution had only just begun to explore? The morning light filters through canopies that would seem alien to our modern eyes, yet strangely beautiful in their unfamiliarity. These are not the simple conifer forests of earlier eras, but complex tapestries woven from an entirely new kind of plant life. The flowering plants, those modest pioneers of the Jurassic, have undergone a transformation so complete that they now dominate landscapes across much of the planet. Picture yourself standing at the edge of one of these early Cretaceous forests, perhaps 140 million years ago. The trees around you bear flowers of extraordinary diversity, some as large as dinner plates, others tiny and delicate as dewdrops. The colors range from pure white to deep crimson, from sunny yellow to rich purple, creating a visual symphony that no previous epoch had ever witnessed. But it is not just the beauty of these flowers that marks them as revolutionary. Each bloom represents a partnership, a covenant between plant and animal that would reshape the very foundations of terrestrial ecosystems. As you watch, insects move from flower to flower, their bodies dusted with pollen, their movements guided by instincts that are themselves evolving in response to this new abundance. The bees that visit these ancient blossoms are not quite like their modern descendants. Their social structures are simpler, their dances less complex, but they carry within their genetic code the potential for all the sophisticated behaviors that will one day make them masters of pollination. The butterflies that flutter through these primeval gardens possess wingspans that dwarf their modern relatives, their colors so vivid they seem to glow with their own inner light. This explosion of floral diversity was not happening in isolation. The success of flowering plants was creating new opportunities for countless other forms of life. Herbivorous dinosaurs were adapting their feeding strategies to take advantage of these new food sources. Some developed specialized teeth for processing the softer tissues of flowering plants, while others evolved elaborate grinding mechanisms for breaking down seeds and fruits. Can you picture one of these early Cretaceous herbivores as it moves through a meadow carpeted with primitive flowers? Perhaps it is a duck-billed hadrosaur, its broad beak perfectly adapted for cropping the tender shoots and blossoms that carpet the forest floor. Its movements are careful and deliberate, each bite selected with an almost artistic precision. The carnivorous dinosaurs were also responding to these changes, though in more indirect ways. As their prey species adapted to new food sources and evolved new behaviors, the predators had to evolve as well. Some grew larger and more powerful, developing the massive jaws and bone-crushing teeth that would make them the most fearsome land predators in Earth's history. Others took a different path, becoming smaller and more agile, their bodies increasingly bird-like as they pursued prey through dense vegetation or even into the canopy itself. These smaller theropods were refining the art of flight, their feathers becoming more sophisticated with each passing generation. The skies of the Cretaceous were becoming increasingly crowded with flying creatures. The pterosaurs had reached the peak of their evolutionary success, with some species achieving wingspans that exceeded 35 feet. These aerial giants soared over landscapes that stretched to every horizon, their keen eyes scanning for fish in the shallow seas or carrion on the plains below. But they dinosaurs, those remarkable creatures that at first were no longer alone in the air. The flying taken wing in the Jurassic forests were becoming increasingly sophisticated in their mastery of flight. Their wings were developing the complex structure of modern bird feathers, with intricate arrangements of barbs and barbules that could generate lift and provide precise control over their movements. Some of these early birds retained many primitive characteristics. They still possessed teeth in their jaws, claws on their wings, and long, bony tails that spoke of their dinosaurian heritage. But others were already showing the streamlined bodies and reduced tails that would become typical of more advanced birds. The marine realm of the Cretaceous was equally dynamic. The seas had risen to levels not seen since the early Paleozoic, flooding vast areas of the continents and creating shallow tropical waters that teemed with life. The marine reptiles had achieved a diversity that would never be equaled in later periods. The ichthyosaurs, those dolphin-like masters of the Mesozoic seas, were reaching their evolutionary zenith. Some species had evolved eyes larger than any vertebrate before or since, perfect spheres of vision that could detect prey in the darkest depths of ancient oceans. Their bodies had become so perfectly adapted for aquatic life that they seemed more like living torpedoes than reptiles. Swimming alongside them were the plesiosaurs, creatures that had taken a completely different approach to marine predation. The long-necked forms had evolved necks of extraordinary length and flexibility, allowing them to strike at fish with lightning speed while their bodies remained motionless in the water. The short-necked species had developed massive heads and powerful jaws that could crush the shells of the largest marine invertebrates. But perhaps the most remarkable inhabitants of the Cretaceous seas were the mosasaurs, marine lizards that had only recently taken to aquatic life, but were already becoming some of the ocean's most fearsome predators. These creatures retained more obviously reptilian characteristics than their ichthyosaur and plesiosaur contemporaries, but they had modified their basic lizard body plan in extraordinary ways. Can you imagine encountering one of these marine giants in the warm, shallow seas of the Cretaceous? Perhaps it emerges from the depths like a living submarine, its massive jaws opening to reveal rows of sharp teeth designed for gripping struggling prey. Its paddle-like limbs propel it through the water with surprising grace for such a large creature, while its powerful tail provides the thrust needed for rapid acceleration. The seafloor beneath these marine predators was carpeted with life forms that were themselves undergoing remarkable evolutionary changes. The ammonites, those spiral-shelled cephalopods that had been among the most successful marine animals for hundreds of millions of years, were reaching new heights of diversity and complexity. Some ammonite shells had evolved into fantastic spiral sculptures with elaborate ribs, spines, and chambers that served purposes we can only guess at. Others had become streamlined for rapid swimming, their shells reduced to simple, efficient curves that offered minimal resistance to the water. Still others had developed shells so bizarre and complex that they seem more like abstract art than functional anatomy. The coral reefs of the Cretaceous were also undergoing a renaissance. The simple coral communities of the Triassic and Jurassic had given way to complex ecosystems that rivaled modern tropical reefs in their diversity and productivity. These ancient reefs were built by rudists, unusual bivalve mollusks that had evolved to fill the ecological role that corals play in modern seas. These rudist reefs created complex three-dimensional habitats that supported an incredible variety of marine life. Fish of countless species darted through the reef structures, their scales glinting in the filtered sunlight. Crinoids, those flower-like echinoderms, swayed in the currents like underwater gardens. Countless varieties of marine invertebrates found shelter and food among the reef crevices. The land masses of the Cretaceous were also experiencing their own transformations. The supercontinent of Pangaea, which had dominated the Earth's geography since before the Great Dying, was finally breaking apart in earnest. The Atlantic Ocean was widening, separating the Americas from Europe and Africa. India was beginning its long journey northward toward its eventual collision with Asia. These geological changes were creating new climate patterns and new opportunities for biological diversification. As the continents separated, populations of plants and animals became isolated on different land masses, allowing evolution to explore different solutions to similar challenges. On the northern continents, vast forests of flowering trees were beginning to dominate the landscape. Oak, maple, and walnut trees were among the early pioneers, their broad leaves creating dense canopies that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. Beneath these canopies, an understory of smaller flowering plants was creating the kind of layered ecosystem structure that characterizes modern temperate forests. The southern continents were developing their own distinctive flora and fauna. In what would eventually become Australia and Antarctica, still connected at this time and positioned much closer to the equator, unique communities of plants and animals were evolving in isolation from their northern relatives. Some of the most remarkable dinosaurs of the entire Mesozoic era were evolving in these southern lands. The titanosaurs, massive, long-necked herbivores that would eventually become the largest land animals ever to exist, were beginning their extraordinary growth toward gigantism. These creatures were not simply scaled-up versions of earlier sauropods. They were evolutionary marvels that pushed the very limits of what was possible for terrestrial vertebrates. Can you imagine standing beside one of these colossal creatures as it moves through a Cretaceous forest? The ground trembles slightly with each footstep, and the sound of its breathing is like a distant wind through caves. Its neck stretches upward, disappearing into the canopy high above, while its massive tail sweeps back and forth behind it like a living bridge. The engineering challenges posed by such enormous size had required evolutionary solutions of extraordinary elegance. The hearts of these giants had to pump blood through necks that could extend 50 feet or more above the ground. Their hollow bones had to provide structural support while keeping body weight manageable. Their digestive systems had to process enormous quantities of plant material every day to fuel their massive metabolisms. But size was not the only direction that dinosaur evolution was exploring during the Cretaceous. At the other end of the spectrum, some lineages were becoming smaller and more specialized. The troodontids, small theropod dinosaurs with enlarged brains and keen senses, were developing intelligence levels that may have rivaled those of modern birds. These intelligent dinosaurs possessed forward-facing eyes that provided excellent depth perception, perfect for judging distances when leaping from branch to branch or striking at small prey. Their hands were equipped with sharp claws that could manipulate objects with surprising dexterity. Some species may have even used simple tools, though the evidence for this remains tantalizingly incomplete in the fossil record. The ceratopsians, those spectacular horned dinosaurs that would become icons of the Cretaceous period, were also reaching their evolutionary peak during this time. Triceratops, with its massive skull and impressive array of horns and frills, was just one of dozens of species that had evolved elaborate cranial ornaments. These skull decorations served multiple purposes. They provided protection during combat with predators or rivals. They served as display structures for attracting mates or intimidating competitors, and they may have helped with thermoregulation, providing large surface areas for dissipating excess body heat in the warm Cretaceous climate. Picture one of these magnificent creatures as it grazes peacefully in a field of primitive grasses and flowering herbs. Its massive head moves slowly from side to side as it crops vegetation, the elaborate frill around its neck catching the sunlight like a living crown. When it raises its head to scan for danger, the three horns on its face give it an almost mythical appearance. The armored dinosaurs, the ankylosaurs and their relatives, had also achieved remarkable diversity during the Cretaceous. Some species had evolved into living tanks, their backs covered with thick plates and spikes that made them virtually invulnerable to attack. Others had developed massive clubs at the ends of their tails that could deliver bone-crushing blows to any predator foolish enough to approach too closely. But perhaps the most famous of all Cretaceous dinosaurs were the tyrannosaurs, those massive predators that have captured human imagination like no other prehistoric creatures. Tyrannosaurus rex, the king of the tyrant lizards, was the culmination of millions of years of predator evolution, a creature so perfectly adapted for hunting large prey that it remains the standard by which all other land predators are measured. Can you imagine the moment when one of these apex predators emerges from the forest shadows? Its massive head, nearly 6 feet in length, is equipped with teeth like railroad spikes, each one designed for crushing bone and tearing flesh. Its tiny arms, so often mocked in popular culture, are actually incredibly powerful, capable of lifting weights that would challenge a modern human. Its legs are pillars of muscle and bone, perfectly engineered for delivering devastating charges at speeds that would have made it one of the fastest large land animals of its time. When it roars, the sound carries for miles across the Cretaceous landscape, a declaration of dominance that sends smaller creatures scurrying for cover. Yet even these magnificent predators were not immune to the forces of change that were constantly reshaping the biological world. The late Cretaceous was a time of increasing instability, both geological and climatic. Sea levels were fluctuating dramatically, alternately flooding and exposing vast areas of the continents. Volcanic activity was increasing in many parts of the world, adding ash and gases to an already stressed atmosphere. The flowering plants that had revolutionized terrestrial ecosystems were continuing to diversify and spread, but their success was coming at the expense of more ancient plant groups. The conifers and ferns that had dominated earlier landscapes were being pushed into increasingly marginal habitats. These changes in plant communities were having cascading effects throughout the food web. Some dinosaur species were thriving in these changing conditions, but others were struggling to adapt. The long-necked sauropods, those gentle giants that had been so successful throughout the Jurassic and early Cretaceous, were declining in diversity in many parts of the world. The ecological niches they had occupied for millions of years were being filled by other types of herbivores better adapted to the new plant communities. The marine realm was also showing signs of stress. Many of the marine reptile groups that had dominated Mesozoic seas were beginning to decline. The ichthyosaurs, those perfectly adapted ocean predators, had already gone extinct by the middle of the Cretaceous period. The plesiosaurs were hanging on, but their diversity was much reduced from earlier peaks. Even the ammonites, those extraordinarily successful marine cephalopods, were showing signs of evolutionary exhaustion. Many of their shell forms had become increasingly bizarre and specialized, perhaps indicating that they were struggling to find new evolutionary solutions to changing ocean conditions. The stage was being set for another great transition, though none of the magnificent creatures living in the late Cretaceous could have imagined what was coming. High above the Earth's atmosphere, a mountain-sized piece of rock and metal was hurtling through the cold vacuum of space, following an orbit that would bring it into collision with our planet. But for now, in this moment frozen in deep time, the Cretaceous world continued its ancient rhythms. Dinosaurs roamed forests of flowering trees. Pterosaurs soared over shallow seas. Marine reptiles hunted in tropical waters that stretched from pole to pole. It was a world of such biological richness and diversity that it seemed as though life had finally achieved a perfect balance, a sustainable paradise that could continue forever. The mammals of this period remained small and relatively inconspicuous, though they were quietly diversifying in the shadows of their reptilian contemporaries. Some had taken to the trees, developing the grasping hands and keen eyesight that would eventually characterize the primate lineage. Others had returned to aquatic environments, experimenting with the adaptations that would one day produce whales and dolphins. These early mammals possessed many of the characteristics that would eventually make them successful: efficient metabolisms that allowed them to remain active in cool conditions, sophisticated sensory systems that helped them navigate complex environments, and flexible behaviors that allowed them to exploit a wide variety of ecological niches. But they were still minor players in Cretaceous ecosystems. The largest mammals of this period were no bigger than modern house cats, and most were much smaller. They lived in the spaces between the giants, finding food and shelter in microhabitats that the larger reptiles could not access. Some mammals had developed specialized feeding strategies that allowed them to coexist with the dominant reptiles. There were insectivores with sharp teeth for catching small prey, seed eaters with grinding molars for processing plant material, and even some that may have fed on dinosaur eggs and hatchlings. The social behaviors of these early mammals were also becoming increasingly complex. Some species may have lived in family groups, with parents caring for their young for extended periods. Others might have formed larger communities, sharing information about food sources and dangers through sophisticated communication systems. As the Cretaceous period progressed toward its fateful conclusion, these small mammals were quietly accumulating the adaptations that would allow them to survive the coming catastrophe and eventually inherit the Earth. Their small size would prove to be an advantage when food became scarce. Their efficient metabolisms would help them survive in harsh conditions. Their behavioral flexibility would allow them to adapt to rapidly changing environments. But all of this lay in the future. For now, the Cretaceous world continued its magnificent dance of evolution and adaptation, each species playing its part in the grand symphony of life that had been building since the recovery from the Great Dying. The volcanic giant that had once threatened to end the story of life had instead catalyzed the most spectacular chapter in the planet's biological history. The flowering meadows swayed in ancient breezes. The mighty dinosaurs continued their eternal search for food and mates. The pterosaurs rode the thermals rising from sun-warmed seas. And deep in the forest shadows, small mammals went about their modest lives, unaware that they carried within their genes the future of terrestrial life on Earth. This was the world that 66 million years ago was about to face its next great test. Another chapter in the endless story of extinction and renewal that has characterized life on Earth since its very beginning. The Cretaceous giants would soon join the trilobites and the Carboniferous insects in the fossil record, but their legacy would live on in ways they could never have imagined. The birds that filled the skies carried dinosaur blood in their veins. The flowering plants that carpeted the continents bore the genetic memory of their Cretaceous ancestors. And somewhere in the underbrush, the small mammals that would one day give rise to whales and elephants, to bats and humans, continued their patient evolution toward an unimaginable future. The Earth turned on its axis, carrying its cargo of magnificent life toward another moment of transformation, another test of resilience and adaptability. The story that had begun with the Great Dying was approaching another climax, but had learned too much, grown too diverse, was far from over. Life become too creative to be easily extinguished. And so the Cretaceous world lived on in that eternal moment before the next great change, perfect in its complexity and beautiful in its abundance. A testament to the incredible creative power of evolution when given time and space to explore every possibility that the laws of physics and chemistry would allow. The morning sun cast long shadows across landscapes that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of countless heartbeats, each one marking another moment in the grand symphony that had been building for millions of years since that ancient catastrophe. Yet somewhere in the vast tapestry of space, forces were already stirring that would soon write the next chapter in life's endless story of transformation. Can you picture the serenity of that late Cretaceous world as it basked in what would be its final golden age? The air was warm and humid, carrying the perfume of countless flowers that had learned to paint themselves in colors evolution had never dreamed of before. Gentle breezes stirred the broad leaves of primitive magnolias and early palms, while in the distance, the calls of creatures great and small created a natural orchestra that had been rehearsing for tens of millions of years. In the shallow inland seas that stretched across much of what we now call North America, marine life moved in patterns that seemed almost choreographed. Schools of primitive fish swirled through the water like living clouds, their scales catching and reflecting the filtered sunlight that penetrated the clear waters. Among them moved the last of the great marine reptiles, their powerful bodies cutting through the water with a grace that spoke of perfect adaptation to their liquid world. The mosasaurs, those magnificent marine lizards that had so recently claimed dominion over the ancient seas, glided through their underwater kingdoms with the confidence of creatures that had never known defeat. Their serpentine bodies, some stretching nearly 50 feet from nose to tail, moved with an undulating rhythm that was both powerful and strangely hypnotic. When they surfaced to breathe, their massive heads broke the water with barely a splash, testament to their perfect hydrodynamic design. Beneath the waves, the seafloor itself told stories of abundance and diversity that future ages would struggle to imagine. Vast beds of giant clams carpeted the bottom, their shells opening and closing in slow, synchronized movements as they filtered nutrients from the water above. Among them, sea urchins moved like living pincushions, their spines creating gardens of calcium carbonate that served as shelter for countless smaller creatures. The ammonites, Those spiral-shelled masters of ancient seas still held court in the deeper waters, though their once magnificent diversity had begun to show signs of strain. Their shells, coiled in perfect mathematical spirals, caught and reflected light in ways that turned them into living jewels drifting through the ocean depths. Some had grown to enormous sizes, their shells nearly as large as wagon wheels, while others had become delicate miniatures, no bigger than coins. On the continents above, the great dinosaurs continued their eternal routines of feeding, mating, and raising young, blissfully unaware that they were living through the final chapters of their remarkable evolutionary story. In the river valleys and coastal plains, massive herds of duck-billed hadrosaurs moved like living tsunamis across the landscape, their powerful legs churning up clouds of dust that could be seen for miles. Can you imagine the sound these herds would have made as they migrated across the ancient continents? The thundering of thousands of feet against the earth would have created a drumbeat that seemed to emerge from the very heart of the planet. Their calls to one another, a complex symphony of honks, whistles, and trumpets, would have carried across vast distances, announcing their presence to every creature within 100 miles. The carnivorous dinosaurs that shadowed these great herds moved with a different kind of majesty, their steps measured and deliberate as they searched for opportunities among the abundance. The tyrannosaurs, those apex predators that had reached the pinnacle of terrestrial predation, stalked through forests and across plains with the confidence of creatures that had never met their match. Picture one of these magnificent hunters as it pauses at the edge of a clearing, its massive head turning slowly as it scans the landscape with eyes that missed nothing. Its nostrils flare as it tests the air for the scent of prey, while its powerful legs shift restlessly, ready to launch into a charge that would shake the very ground. When it finally moves, every step is a study in controlled power, each footfall carefully placed for maximum efficiency and stealth. Yet even these mighty predators showed a gentleness that might surprise us. Fossil evidence suggests that many dinosaurs, including some of the largest carnivores, cared for their young with a tenderness that rivaled that of modern birds. Parent tyrannosaurs may have brought food to their nestlings for months, protecting them from danger and teaching them the skills they would need to survive in their competitive world. The skies above these terrestrial dramas were filled with their own cast of remarkable characters. The pterosaurs had reached sizes that defied belief, with some species boasting wingspans that exceeded those of small aircraft. These aerial giants rode the thermals and wind currents with an effortlessness that spoke of millions of years of evolutionary refinement. Imagine looking up to see one of these colossal flyers passing overhead, its shadow momentarily blocking out the sun as it soars silently across the sky. Its wings, stretched taut between elongated finger bones, barely moved as it caught and rode the invisible rivers of rising air. Its keen eyes, positioned high above the landscape, could spot movement from distances that would challenge even the most sophisticated modern instruments. But the pterosaurs were no longer alone in their mastery of the air. The birds, those remarkable descendants of small theropod dinosaurs, had begun to establish their own aerial kingdoms. While most were still relatively small compared to their pterosaur contemporaries, they possessed advantages that would prove crucial in the trials to come. Their feathers, those evolutionary marvels that had first appeared as simple insulation, had become sophisticated flight instruments capable of providing both lift and precise control. Their hollow bones, inherited from their dinosaurian ancestors, made them incredibly light without sacrificing strength. Their rapid metabolisms allowed them to maintain the high activity levels that powered flight required. Some of these early birds had already begun to explore ecological niches that would become familiar to us today. There were fishing specialists with long, narrow beaks perfect for snatching prey from shallow waters. Others had developed the curved talons and powerful wings of aerial hunters. Still others were experimenting with the seed-cracking beaks that would eventually make them masters of terrestrial plant life. Can you picture these pioneers of avian evolution as they went about their daily lives in the Cretaceous world? Perhaps a small fishing bird stands motionless at the edge of a quiet stream, its reflection perfectly mirrored in the still water. Suddenly, it strikes with lightning speed, emerging with a silver fish writhing in its beak. With a quick toss of its head, it swallows its catch and returns to its patient vigil. Meanwhile, in the canopy above, other birds were learning to navigate the complex, three-dimensional world of the treetops. Their grasping feet, evolved from the clawed hands of their dinosaur ancestors, allowed them to perch on branches of any size. Their keen eyesight helped them spot insects hiding among the leaves, while their quick reflexes allowed them to snatch prey from the air with remarkable precision. The flowering plants that formed the foundation of these Cretaceous ecosystems were themselves approaching new heights of diversity and sophistication. The simple blooms of the early Cretaceous had given way to elaborate floral displays that seemed designed to capture and hold the attention of any creature that might serve as a pollinator. Some flowers had grown to enormous sizes, their petals spreading like colorful umbrellas to attract pollinators from great distances. Others had developed intricate shapes and patterns that served as landing platforms for specific insects, creating partnerships so precise that neither plant nor pollinator could survive without the other. The trees themselves were becoming increasingly complex in their architecture. Early flowering trees had experimented with different strategies for presenting their blooms to pollinators. Some produced flowers directly from their trunks, creating spectacular displays that could be seen and accessed even by ground-dwelling creatures. Others held their blooms high in the canopy, creating aerial gardens that attracted flying pollinators. Beneath these flowering canopies, the forest floors were carpeted with an incredible diversity of smaller flowering plants. Primitive lilies and early orchids created patches of color among the green, while tiny ground-hugging flowers formed living mosaics that seemed to shift and change with the passing seasons. The insects that moved through these floral wonderlands were themselves marvels of evolutionary adaptation. Butterflies with wingspans that dwarfed their modern relatives drifted through the air like living stained glass windows, their colors so vibrant they seemed to glow with inner light. Bees with bodies the size of small birds visited flowers with a precision that spoke of millions of years of coevolutionary refinement. Some insects had developed relationships with specific plants that bordered on the miraculous. Certain beetles had evolved body shapes that perfectly matched the architecture of particular flowers, allowing them to access nectar that was unavailable to any other creature. In return, they carried pollen with an efficiency that no general pollinator could match. Can you imagine the morning ritual that took place in these ancient gardens as the sun rose over the Cretaceous world? The air would have been filled with the gentle hum of countless wings as insects began their daily rounds among the flowers. The sound would have been almost musical, a natural symphony that spoke of cooperation and abundance on a scale that our modern world can barely comprehend. Yet beneath this surface tranquility, subtle changes were beginning to manifest themselves across the planet. The volcanic activity that had been a constant feature of Earth's geology was entering a new phase of intensity. In what would eventually become India, massive eruptions were beginning to pour lava across vast areas of the landscape, creating flood basalts that would eventually cover an area larger than modern-day France. These Deccan traps, as geologists would later name them, were not yet approaching the scale of the ancient Siberian eruptions that had caused the Great Dying, but they were adding significant amounts of ash and gas to an atmosphere that was already showing signs of stress from other sources. The climate was becoming increasingly unstable, with dramatic swings in temperature and precipitation that challenged the adaptive capabilities of even the most successful species. The oceans, too, were beginning to show signs of disturbance. Sea levels, which had remained relatively stable throughout much of the Cretaceous, were starting to fluctuate more dramatically. Some coastal areas that had been submerged for millions of years were beginning to emerge as dry land, while others that had supported terrestrial ecosystems were disappearing beneath rising waters. These changing conditions were having cascading effects throughout the marine food webs. The microscopic plankton that formed the base of oceanic ecosystems were struggling to adapt to changing water chemistry and temperature. As their populations fluctuated, the effects rippled upward through every level of the food chain. The great marine reptiles, those magnificent predators that had ruled the Mesozoic seas for so long, were beginning to show signs of stress. Some species were declining in numbers, while others were retreating to increasingly restricted ranges. The complex ecological relationships that had sustained them for millions of years were beginning to unravel. On land, similar pressures were affecting terrestrial ecosystems. The great dinosaur communities that had dominated continental environments for over 160 million years were facing challenges that tested their evolutionary flexibility. Climate change was altering vegetation patterns, forcing herbivorous species to adapt their feeding strategies or migrate to new areas. Some dinosaur species were proving remarkably adaptable to these changing conditions. The smaller, more generalized forms often showed the greatest resilience, their flexible behaviors allowing them to exploit new opportunities as they arose. The largest species, those magnificent giants that had become symbols of dinosaur success, were often the most vulnerable to environmental change. Can you picture one of the last great titanosaurs as it moves slowly through a landscape that no longer provides the abundant food sources its ancestors had enjoyed? Its massive body, once perfectly adapted to a world of plenty, now requires enormous amounts of vegetation just to maintain basic metabolic functions. Each day becomes a struggle to find enough food to fuel its colossal frame. The armored dinosaurs, Those living tanks that had seemed so invulnerable to predation were discovering that their heavy armor was a liability in a world where mobility and adaptability were becoming increasingly important. Their specialized body plans, perfected over millions of years of evolution, were proving difficult to modify in response to rapidly changing conditions. Yet, even as these ancient lineages struggled with environmental pressures, new forms of life were emerging that seemed better suited to the changing world. The mammals, those small, warm-blooded creatures that had lived in the shadows of the dinosaurs for so long, were beginning to show increased diversity and ecological importance. Some mammal species were growing larger, occupying ecological niches that smaller forms had never been able to exploit. Others were developing increasingly specialized feeding strategies, allowing them to extract energy from food sources that other animals could not utilize. Their efficient metabolisms and behavioral flexibility were proving to be significant advantages in an increasingly unpredictable world. The early primates, ancestors of a lineage that would eventually produce our own species, were among the mammals that were thriving in the changing Cretaceous environment. These small, arboreal creatures possessed keen eyesight and grasping hands that made them perfectly suited for life in the complex three-dimensional world of the forest canopy. Picture one of these early primates as it moves through the treetops of a late Cretaceous forest. Its large eyes, adapted for judging distances in the dappled light beneath the canopy, scan constantly for both food and danger. Its handsable thumbs, equipped with opos, allow it to grasp branches of any size with perfect security. When it leaps from tree to tree, its movements are calculated with a precision that speaks of sophisticated spatial intelligence remarkably complex for creatures of their size. Some species lived in family groups with parents and larger communities, sharing information about resources and dangers, and offspring cooperating in the search for food and the defense of territory. Others form these early mammals made to one another were beginning. These small mammals were developing social behaviors that were through sophisticated communication systems. The calls to show the complexity that would eventually Guyverevises or crack rise to language. Different vocalizations conveyed specific information about food sources, predator threats, and to use simple tools, using sticks and stones to extract insects from side social relationships. Some species were even beginning. As the late Cretaceous prog, open hard-shelled fruits, rest toward its fateful conclusion, these small mammals were quietly size, efficient metabole accumulating the adaptations that would allow them to inherit the earth. Their smallisms and behavioral flexibility were preparing them for survival in a world that would soon undergo changes more dramatic than any that had occurred since the Great Dying. But none of the creatures living in this late Cretaceous paradise could have imagined the nature of the catastrophe that was approaching. High above the Earth's atmosphere, invisible against the star-filled darkness of space, a mountain of rock and metal was following an orbital path that would bring it into collision with our planet at a speed that defied comprehension. This cosmic wanderer, perhaps 10 miles in diameter, had been traveling through the void for millions of years, occasionally passing close enough to other worlds to have its trajectory slightly altered by their gravitational fields. Now, by cosmic coincidence, its path was converging with that of Earth, setting up an encounter that would reshape the planet's biological history as thoroughly as the Siberian volcanic eruptions had done 186 million years earlier. Yet for now, in this moment suspended in deep time, the Cretaceous world continued its ancient rhythms. Dinosaurs grazed in flowering meadows that stretched to every horizon. Pterosaurs soared over seas that teemed with marine life. In the forest shadows, small mammals went about their modest lives, carrying within their genes the future of terrestrial life on Earth. The morning mists rose from primeval swamps, where the last surviving amphibians still practiced lifestyles that had changed little since the Carboniferous. Ancient conifers, survivors from earlier ages, stood like living monuments among the newer flowering trees. Everywhere, life displayed the incredible creativity and resilience that had allowed it to recover from every previous catastrophe. Can you feel the peace of this ancient world as it existed in those final moments before everything changed? The gentle lapping of waves on shores that would soon be transformed beyond recognition. The soft rustling of leaves in forests that had taken millions of years to reach their current complexity. The distant calls of creatures that had no way of knowing they were living through the end of an age. In the shallow seas, the last ammonites drifted through waters that sparkled with bioluminescent plankton. Their spiral shells, perfect examples of mathematical beauty, caught and reflected light in patterns that created underwater galaxies of living stars. These ancient mariners had survived multiple mass extinctions, their lineage stretching back nearly 500 million years, yet they were about to encounter a challenge unlike any they had faced before. The marine reptiles that shared these waters with them continued their eternal hunt for prey, their powerful bodies slicing through the water with predatory grace. The plesiosaurs, with their long necks and powerful flippers, moved like underwater dragons through forests of marine vegetation. The mosasaurs, those serpentine giants, patrolled the deeper waters like living submarines, their presence felt rather than seen by the smaller creatures that shared their domain. On the continents, the great herds of herbivorous dinosaurs continued their seasonal migrations, following ancient pathways that their ancestors had established millions of years before. The ground trembled beneath their passage, and their calls carried for miles across landscapes that seemed to stretch beyond the edges of imagination. The carnivorous dinosaurs that followed these herds moved with the patient confidence of creatures that had perfected the art of predation over geological ages. Their keen senses, honed by millions of years of evolution, could detect the slightest sign of weakness or opportunity among their potential prey. Yet they too were part of a delicate ecological balance that had taken eons to establish. In the forest canopies, early birds were learning to exploit resources that no creature had ever accessed before. Their ability to fly opened up three-dimensional worlds of opportunity, allowing them to harvest insects from the highest branches and build nests in locations that were safe from ground-dwelling predators. Some of these early birds were already showing the intelligence and adaptability that would eventually make their descendants among the most successful animals on Earth. They were learning to use tools, to modify their environment to suit their needs, and to pass knowledge from one generation to the next through increasingly sophisticated behaviors. The mammals that scurried through the underbrush and climbed through the lower branches were conducting their own evolutionary experiments in survival and adaptation. Some had developed the ability to hibernate, allowing them to survive periods when food was scarce. Others had evolved the capacity for extended parental care, giving their offspring the best possible chance of survival in a competitive world. These small creatures possessed something that many of their larger contemporaries lacked: the ability to adapt quickly to changing conditions. Their short generation times meant that evolution could work much more rapidly on their populations, allowing them to respond to environmental pressures within dozens of generations rather than thousands. As the sun set over this ancient world for what would be the last time in its current configuration, the stage was set for one of the most dramatic transformations in Earth's long history. The cosmic collision that was approaching would not just end the age of dinosaurs, it would fundamentally alter the trajectory of life on Earth, opening up opportunities for new forms of existence that had never before been possible. Yet even in the face of such ultimate catastrophe, life would prove once again that it possesses a resilience and creativity that transcends any single disaster. The survivors of the coming impact would inherit a world stripped of many of its most magnificent creatures, but they would use that devastation as an opportunity to explore new evolutionary pathways that would eventually produce wonders even greater than those that were about to be lost. The mammals that huddled in their burrows, the birds that roosted in their hidden nests, the marine creatures that dwelt in the deepest parts of the ocean, all carried within their genes the potential for futures that would span millions of years. They were the inheritors of a biological legacy that stretched back to the very origins of life on Earth, and they would prove worthy of that inheritance. And so the Cretaceous world settled into its final night, unaware that dawn would bring changes more profound than any that had occurred since life first crawled from the primordial seas. The story that had begun with the Great Dying was approaching another climactic moment, but it was far from over. Life had learned too much, grown too diverse, become too creative to be easily extinguished by any single catastrophe, no matter how severe. The gentle sounds of that ancient night, the calls of unknown creatures, and the whisper of wind through primitive forests faded into the eternal silence of deep time, carrying with them the last moments of a world that would never be seen again. Yet in that silence lay the promise of new stories, new adventures, new chapters in the endless book of life on Earth. As we drift toward the end of this ancient story, we find ourselves witnesses to one of the most profound truths about life on our planet. The Siberian giant that emerged from the depths of the Earth 252 million years ago was indeed a killer of unimaginable scale, claiming 9 out of every 10 species that called our world home. Yet in destroying so much, it also created something extraordinary. Can you picture the gentle irony of it all? The very force that seemed destined to end life's story instead became the author of its most magnificent chapters. The Great Dying cleared the stage for innovations that might never have emerged in a world already crowded with ancient forms. The archosaurs that rose from the ashes would give us dinosaurs. The small mammals that survived in hidden refuges would eventually produce whales and elephants, bats, and humans. Perhaps this is the most comforting lesson from deep time. Even the darkest chapters in Earth's history carry within them the seeds of renewal and wonder. The volcanic giant's reign of destruction lasted for hundreds of thousands of years, Yet life found ways to persist, to adapt, to dream new dreams in the recovering world that followed. Tonight, as you close your eyes, remember that you are part of this endless story of resilience and transformation. The very atoms in your body were forged in ancient stars. The oxygen you breathe was gifted by countless generations of photosynthetic organisms, and the genetic code that makes you unique carries echoes of survivors who weathered the greatest catastrophe in life's history. The Siberian traps still mark the landscape today, silent monuments to destruction and renewal. But they no longer burn. The earth has healed, life has returned, more diverse and wonderful than ever before. And the story continues, flowing onward like a river with no end, carrying us all toward futures we can barely imagine. Sleep well, knowing that you are part of something larger and more enduring than any single disaster could ever diminish. The story of life goes on, and you are its newest chapter.